This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios Podcast Network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, rate the podcast on Spotify, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Remember, we have a merch store on TeePublic. You can get all of your Graceful Atheist and Secular Grace themed items. You can find the link in the show notes. If you're in the middle of doubt, deconstruction, the dark night of the soul, you do not have to do it alone. Join our private Facebook group, Deconversion Anonymous, and become a part of the community. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guest today is Jordon. Jordon grew up in a very insular Mennonite environment. He didn't have TV. He didn't go to public school. But when he went to university, everything changed. Today, Jordon is a PhD candidate in philosophy. He teaches about the self. Here is Jordon telling his story. Jordon, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been a fan of the show for a while, and I've been interested in coming on and having a conversation with you.
Fantastic. Thank you for reaching out. It sounds like you have a Mennonite background, which we'll obviously get into here in a minute. Let's just start. Tell us about what it was like growing up for you. What religious tradition did you grow up in?
Sure. Yeah. So I did grow up in the Mennonite tradition. For listeners who might not be familiar with that, it's a small religious group that originated in Europe and basically broke away from the Catholic Church over disagreements about things like baptism. So one of the central tenets of the Mennonite tradition and the Anabaptist tradition in general, so there are other groups that are associated that might not call themselves Mennonite, would be that they baptize people who are of age, not rather than baptizing infants, things like that. So that was one of the major things that they disagreed with over sort of the mainstream Catholic and Protestant groups at the time. So that's kind of the origin of it. But one of the other central tenets is nonviolence or pacifism. So I grew up with that as well. But in general, it was a pretty insular kind of upbringing. I'm from a pretty small town in Pennsylvania. I grew up on a farm. So there's kind of like a tradition of agriculture, that kind of thing, or very working class kinds of jobs. So that's sort of part of the whole kind of culture. I went to a very small religious school as well. Didn't go to public school for 12 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the kind of general setup, as it were.
And then a question I often like to ask is, when you were growing up, was it something that you took on yourself, or was it something you were just kind of following in your parents and the community?
Yeah, so my family history goes back to Germany and Switzerland, to the origins of these groups, right? And then they came over from Europe to escape religious persecution because the Catholics didn't like them, the Protestants didn't like them, so they came over to America, and so that's the family tradition. That's the tradition I grew up in. My parents were Mennonite, my grandparents were Mennonite, my great grandparents were Mennonite, going back many generations to Europe. Yeah, so very much something I grew up with. There's very much that sense of history, I think, as well. That the kind of awareness of it as you're growing up. That's something that does get talked about a lot as well. So, yeah, in school as well as church.
Okay, I'm going to ask the question just a little bit different. Internally, did you have like a personal sense of faith, or like, were you just going through the motions, or was it something that you owned yourself in your youth?
Right. Yeah. So I think pretty early on, I had an intuitive sense that there were issues with the faith tradition I grew up in.
Okay.
Nonetheless, I still believed in God And that was something that I took upon myself personally from a relatively young age. Um, so, in the Mennonite tradition, at least the tradition I grew up in, which was quite a conservative variety of it, you joined the church somewhere around the age of, you know, between the ages of maybe 11 and 15. That's kind of the typical age range. So you join the church. That usually goes along with becoming a Christian. So you invite Jesus into your heart, and then you join the church at the same time. You become a member. You have to go through a little kind of process of that. So I did not do that at my parents' church. So I wanted to find some kind of alternative, I guess, to that, because at the time I did identify as a Christian. I did believe in God, but I didn't want to be part of the church that I grew up in.
Interesting. Do you want to expand that a bit? What were some of the issues you were seeing, and why did you make that decision so young?
Yeah, there was some precedent for me not being part of it, in the sense that I did have two older siblings who had left the church. One of them had never joined; the other left after joining. Um, I knew I wanted to go to college, so another thing to mention is that there isn't really a tradition of going to college or higher education in general in this kind of tradition.
Mm-hmm.
There's no intellectual tradition really at all. People don't go to college; they go through through high school. But a lot of people didn't graduate from high school. A lot of young people left, around grade 8, 9, 10, that kind of thing too. That was pretty common, at least when I was growing up. Yeah, so since that was a priority for me, I felt like that sort of came into conflict with some of these the basic ideas of religious tradition I grew up in, but also the rules I grew up with were very restrictive. It was a situation where I grew up without TV, for example. Yeah, no TV. Pretty traditional dress styles, so particularly intense for women, but for men too. There were a lot of rules. I wasn't allowed to wear shorts as a kid, things like that. Mostly button-up shirts. You couldn't go to the movies, things like that. So there was always this sense of kind of missing out on that, even as a kid. Just not wanting to have to deal with all these rules. So I wanted to get away from that. I wanted to be part of something that wasn't so restrictive.
You mentioned, it's fairly insular. Like, was school then an opportunity to expand out of that, or was that also as insular?
It was just as insular, yeah. So the church community that I grew up in, there were a few associated churches that were part of kind of an organization, right?
Okay. Okay.
With similar belief structures, similar beliefs, and so on. There was some variance, but very little. And then those churches supported a small school that went from grades 1 through 12. So that's where I went to school for 12 years. So it was run by the church. All the teachers were Mennonite from the same kind of traditions. There was religious education that was part of the curriculum and pretty much everything we studied. So yeah, it was definitely not an opportunity to kind of break out of that.
So I'm curious where the drive to go to college came from. Was that within your family then, or something else?
So I am a first generation college student, in the sense that nobody else from prior generations had gone to college, but two of my older brothers did go to college. So that, again, there was a little bit of a precedent there for that. They were the two siblings that I had who also were not part of the church.
Okay. And then it sounds like not just church shopping, but you begin to have some issues in your teen years. First, let's start with kind of moving away from the Mennonite church. What happens next after that?
Yeah, well, so initially I actually went to a different Mennonite church. So around the age of 17, I stopped going to my parents' church, and I went to a different Mennonite church. So it was still Mennonite, but it was a much more kind of mainstream, kind of Protestant church. So
Okay.
the church I grew up in, was just like sort of a cappella singing, hymns, that kind of thing. This church, people didn't have the traditional dress styles, music, had a worship band, that kind of thing. So it would have just looked kind of like more of like a mainstream Protestant church to somebody looking on. So I went there for a while because a cousin I had went there, and they sort of invited me to join their band because I played guitar and bass and stuff at the
Okay.
time.
Yeah. And was that fulfilling for a while?
In the short term, it was nice to get away from the really restrictive tradition I grew up in. But ultimately, after I spent a little bit of time there, maybe a year or so, I realized I really didn't fit in there. My own beliefs were continuing to evolve. It was still very conservative in certain ways. And I don't know, I just had this real pervasive sense that I didn't belong there, So, yeah. So at that point, I, um, I was dating a girl who went to a Presbyterian church. So I was kind of bouncing around for a little bit, not really going anywhere consistently. And then when she and I started seeing each other, I attended her church for a while, the Presbyterian church.
And I'm curious then, was that significantly different than the more modern version of the Mennonite church?
Not significantly,
Okay.
no. There were a few things that were a little different, but they were relatively small differences. Yeah. At that point, it was still a pretty conservative branch of Presbyterianism.
Okay.
Um, at the time, I did like the pastor. I felt like he was a nice guy who also, he was highly educated, and that was sort of different, I guess. I liked listening to his sermons at the time, so there was a difference there. But ultimately, I experienced kind of the same thing. I realized that kind of environment, uh, my own beliefs continued to evolve, I think, away from, the kind of conservative stuff that I grew up with. And some of the conservative teachings of the Presbyterian church really didn't sit well with me.
Would you mind getting into the specifics? Like what, so you've mentioned your beliefs were evolving, like, well, like in what direction? What was changing?
Yeah, I mean, some of it was political. So over time, I became more politically liberal.
Mm-hmm.
So the Mennonites, despite having, despite adhering to things like pacifism, for example, that might sound sort of liberal in a broad sense, at least the group I grew up with were very politically conservative. Now, they don't participate in politics, so they don't vote or hold political office or government jobs or anything like that. There's like a kind of separation between those groups and the outside world.
Okay.
But they did kind of espouse a kind of conservative political view. So I grew up with, parents who listened to conservative talk radio and things like that, right? So that's kind of the political atmosphere I grew up in. And over time, I kind of moved away from that and realized my own political beliefs were more liberal than that. So that was part of it. But also just, the Presbyterian church still felt, I felt conservative in ways as well that weren't like necessarily codified. So there were a lot of people there who I guess had, kind of a more conservative outlook in terms of politics, but also just in the way they kind of carried themselves or presented themselves or things like that didn't necessarily make me feel super comfortable. There were a lot of still kind of prohibitions around sex and sexuality that I wasn't super comfortable with. So that was a big part of it. That felt kind of just as conservative as the world I grew up in, to be honest, the Mennonite world. I didn't like that either. I'm starting to really feel like that didn't align with my own values. Yeah.
Would you say like, was there some purity culture like for you specifically, or are you referring to like LGBTQ support?
I mean, some of both, really. Yeah. So definitely the purity culture was something I was more aware of at the time. And that was the kind of thing that really affected me because I'd grown up with this teaching that, sex outside of marriage is wrong. And then I remember a specific instance actually while I was sitting in this, at this, in the service at this Presbyterian church, and the minister, who I had come to respect partly because of his education and things like that, started espousing this kind of view of like, being against, sex outside of marriage or premarital sex or things like that. And I just remember being really turned off by that. It just seemed so, at the time, it seemed so backwards to me. And, I wanted to be free of some of that stuff. I had grown up with it and I was starting to move away from it. And so that was the thing I think that really kind of cemented it for me at the time. And also I realized I had a moment where I really realized that I didn't enjoy going to church. I didn't really like the music. I just felt kind of out of place. Like this is not the place for me. And I realized that I'd been kind of pushing myself to go, even though I didn't like it. And I had this moment one Sunday where I went, or I intended to go, and then I just drove by the church and drove around for a while, and I realized I don't want to go. Why am I going? I don't want to do this.
How did you answer yourself? I mean, what did you decide you just weren't going back, or
Yeah. I decided not to go back. Yeah, after that, I was like, why am I forcing myself to do something I don't want to do? It doesn't make any sense.
yeah?
Yeah. But yeah, the purity culture stuff was definitely a major part of that for sure for me at the time.
And would you say at this time, did you still have a sense of faith? In other words, differentiating deconstructing the church versus deconstructing God, right? Like which of those were you in? Which category are you in?
Yeah, at that point, I was still identifying as having a personal sense of faith,
Okay.
Yeah. So, but I was kind of over the more kind of structured or organized forms of Christianity. But I still would have identified as having some kind of faith. That kind of started to really go away for me around the same time as the time I stopped going to church. So this would have been around the time I was maybe 21,
Okay.
early 20s. So, I'd kind of left my parents' church at 17, even though I was still going to the Mennonite school. So I finished out the Mennonite school while going to, a much more liberal, quote unquote, liberal Mennonite church, then went to the Presbyterian church. And at this point, I was in college. I was still living at home with my parents, but I was taking college classes, learning a lot. And I'm sure that was part of the influence too of just getting a sense of the outside world in a way that I kind of hadn't before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were there any particular things, like any specific doctrines that fell first?
The doctrines part, I mean, I think for me, it wasn't a doctrine so much as I remember really having a profound sense of the problem of evil. At the time,
Yeah.
that was something that really started to bother me. But even before that, like I was having real issues making sense of the idea that that I could pray to God and that God would influence or have power over my life in certain ways. Because then I thought, well, what's the point of me having any kind of sense of ownership over my own life? Like, how could I have any agency or ownership over my own life? How could I take pride in things I've done or even feel guilty about things that I've done or anything like that if I have no real control over my own life, or if some kind of external force can just kind of change things around without, me having any control over it whatsoever. That just seemed really troubling. So I remember at the time, I still prayed and things like that, but I remember thinking like, I can't really pray to have this thing changed because then I'm not living a life that I could be proud of or have any kind of agency over, something like that. So that really bothered me at the time. And then around the same time, the problem of evil, kind of thinking about that really started to bother me as well. The idea that suffering is in the world and that how could I reconcile the suffering, even the own things that I experience with a good or benevolent, all powerful God.
Just as a side note, I think, apologetics is very focused on answering that question. And to my mind, the fact that there is a question, that we identify it as the problem of evil it is the problem, right? You can make as many rationalizations and justifications for that, but almost everyone has to grapple with that issue and come to some conclusion about it.
Yeah. And for me, the kind of standard ways of responding to that issue that I read about or that I started to investigate just weren't satisfying to me.
Right.
Yeah. The idea that, free will or something like that is one way out of it just didn't quite convince me or compel me.
So, it sounds like you're having very serious questions and learning a lot in college, exposed to maybe the wider world a bit. Walk me through like the next steps. What happens after that?
Yeah. So one other thing I should mention too around this time is that, I think a lot of people find a sense of community in in faith communities or traditions that they grow up in or that they're involved in, right? And that was just really lacking for me. I just didn't feel like I fit in or had a sense of community in these places. I would try to integrate myself into them, but it just never really took for me. And some of that was just cultural difference, like the things I was interested in or like talking about or whatever just didn't fit or align with the traditions I was kind of around at the time. So the Mennonite church, again, there's no intellectual tradition, right? People weren't, reading or debating some of these kind of questions that maybe I was kind of starting to think about. I started to become really interested in literature, art, music, philosophy around this time. So I was interested in all that kind of stuff, right? And I started to kind of form a group of friends in my early 20s that were interested in that stuff. I was playing in bands and kind of getting more involved in the little local music scene actually that popped up at the time. So I was really kind of, I think, getting more of a sense of community from that. And I just didn't have a sense of identification with or a sense of community from these churches that I was attending, at the time.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, even the kind of music that was, being played at church, I didn't like any of it really. I participated in the praise and worship band. It was nice to have, an outlet to like play music with other people at the time. But, I felt like the music was kind of corny and it just didn't really do a lot for me. But I'd also grown up with just like these really rigid hymns, and those felt like really traditional, and they didn't appeal to me either. So it was just like no kind of outlet there that really worked for me. So there's a lot of things at the time that just weren't working, but the sense of community I was getting from some of the friendships I was making outside of these church communities, and then also like sense of community from the music scene, and then also like sense of intellectual fulfillment that I was really discovering in college was really kind of gratifying. I was going to like a public, a public non-sectarian university, that was nearby. So I wasn't like part of a religious institution at that point for my education. Yeah.
Everything that the church fears is people going on to get an education in a secular environment. And
Yeah.
But there's a reason why they fear it, right?
There is. And so that was something that really impressed itself upon me growing up. It wasn't even just that people didn't go to college, but it was actively discouraged, right?
Yeah.
So even my own father was like, don't go, like he basically really didn't want me to go. I mean, he couldn't sort of out and out prohibit me from doing it because, I was my own person in some sense, but he was totally opposed to it. I heard other people, ministers and things like that in sermons saying like, we really discourage this kind of thing, right? Because probably for the reasons that, for the kind of influence that those things did have over me in some sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, I had my pastor warn me before I went to Bible college, of all places.
Right.
So yeah, this runs pretty deep, this anti-education bent, I think, within the church. So
yeah. And for me, I think I was a natural student, it was something that I just had like a really strong kind of inclination towards. I was always really good at school. I was always interested in learning. And that was pretty different from most of the kids I grew up with going to this little Mennonite school, because again, the tradition was kind of in the opposite direction. A lot of people left school at grade 8, grade 10, or if they did finish, there's just a culture of kind of like thinking that education was, not valuable. And so I grew up around that. So I think like that further kind of separated me in that sense, because I was good at school and interested in it, kind of like reading things on my own. So that separated me and also gave me a kind of outlet, I think, at some point, just that kind of intellectual fulfillment for me. So that was a huge outlet. And I think just kind of way out of this whole kind of very restrictive world I grew up in.
Yeah. And you talk about just reading on your own, that you're actually exposed to the world a bit by just reading, to seeing that not everyone lives in this restrictive way. And that alone can be a really dangerous thing.
Yeah. So that's the thing. I spent so much time at the library as a kid. Again, I grew up without TV. So like, what do you do with yourself? Well, you read, Yeah. So I read compulsively. I read all the time when I was a kid, and like kind of going into my teenage years, into my 20s, I was just reading all the time.
Anything stand out from that, like either fiction or nonfiction, that really had an impact on you?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, there's stuff that I read later that definitely had a direct influence. But I mean, when I was younger, I was just reading anything really that like I remember like kind of exploring kind of maybe like late teens, early 20s when I was first going to college as well, like reading things like, classic novels or classic literature on the road, or
Mm,
Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, stuff like that,
there you go. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So those were connections to a world that was outside of much, much larger than the world that I grew up in. And I was really interested in literature, so I started studying literature at college
Okay.
at the time. Yeah.
I feel like we're right on the edge here of the story. Is there a moment where you decide, like, I don't believe? I don't want to assume. Maybe you still do. Like, what? Where are you at now, and how did you get to where you're at now?
Yeah, I'm an atheist now. I think there was a period. So after I stopped attending the Presbyterian Church, there was a brief period where I still had a kind of sense of faith. And then that pretty quickly faded. And then I was in this kind of state where I would have called myself an agnostic for a long
Sure.
time.
Okay.
Yeah. So there was a moment when I was traveling. I was a little bit lost in my early 20s. So I had actually taken a break from college at the time. This was around the time of the 2008 economic crash. It wasn't a great time to have left college, to be honest, but I had trouble finding work and stuff. But I managed to find a job, scrape some money together, and I was doing some backpacking. So I was traveling around in New Zealand. I didn't realize it fully at the time, but it was really my attempt to sort of get away from the past, get away from my upbringing, because it's such a pervasive thing. I mean, I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. I couldn't really go anywhere that, without running into people that, I'd grown up with. It just felt like the sense of like, I can't escape from this place, or I need to escape from this place. I can't sort of get away from it when I'm here. Right. So I went to New Zealand, which was pretty much as far away as I could get
Yeah, it's pretty
at
far
the
away.
time. But yeah, I remember, going to a church there, just going in and participating in communion, the service there. And I'd already kind of, at the time was experimenting a bit with alcohol and sometimes drugs. And I felt pretty far removed from it in that moment. And I realized, I think, in that moment when I was in that church that I no longer had any real belief. Um,
Right.
yeah. So that was kind of a real breakthrough moment for me. So I kind of came back from that. I realized that I was an agnostic, and I had this conversation with a friend at the time who said something along those lines, like, I sense that now you're an agnostic or something like that. And I think I may have denied it at the time, but I realized after that conversation, I was like, okay, yeah, I think I am an agnostic now. I don't really feel any sense of the presence of God like I used to feel. I felt really bad about that for a long time. I continued to try to pray, and I wanted to believe. I actually really wanted to believe. I didn't want to let go of it, but it was gone, and there wasn't any bringing it back.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is really common, Jordan. That want to believe, you know, and and just it's just not there. Like you say, it's just gone. So
Yeah.
were you feeling guilty then, or what was that experience like as you kind of acknowledged your agnosticism?
Yeah, I felt guilty and also pretty depressed. And I felt pretty lost at the time. So I grew up in this very rigid world with a lot of rules. And I kind of reacted to some of those rules by wanting to get as far away from them as I could. And some of that was like, I grew up in a culture that, where any kind of self indulgence or any kind of pleasure was kind of forbidden in a lot of ways. Right. So I kind of swung the other way for a little bit. And again, like I was kind of experimenting with alcohol, which I didn't have any experience with, or things like that, or smoking weed, things like that I didn't grow up with, that were totally foreign to me. And
Sure. pretty also common to just, especially like if you grow up in a repressed environment where you're not able to be yourself, make adult choices, that kind of thing. Then you get out, and it's pretty natural to just swing the other way for a bit and experiment with all kinds of things.
Yeah, so I was experimenting with a lot of stuff. Eventually, I was pretty depressed, but struggling with some of those mental health kinds of things at the time.
Okay.
But one of the things that really made a huge difference for me at the time was just going to therapy. So that was another thing that I hadn't really grown up uh, with, but there's some family history for me with some mental health stuff, particularly depression and things like that, anxiety. So I was kind of aware of it a little bit. At the time, I relocated myself. I moved to Pittsburgh and basically ended up finding a way to start therapy. So I did a lot of therapy between the ages of like 23 and maybe like 27, something like that, 28. So sort of my early to mid to late 20s there. I did a lot of therapy. So that really kind of helped me, I don't know, find a little bit more of a balance, kind of accept the kind of unusual upbringing that I'd had. I think in retrospect, I felt pretty alienated in a lot of ways from mainstream American culture, just because my background was so different from other people's that I just felt like there wasn't a lot that I had in common with other people that I might meet, and it wasn't even something that I was totally conscious of. I think it was like a deeper sense of just kind of alienation. So I was alienated kind of from the community I grew up in, never fit in there, never belonged there really. And then a little bit later, I felt sort of alienated from the society that I was in. But therapy kind of helped me resolve some of those feelings. Yeah.
And then I'm curious, was the therapists that you worked with, were they willing to kind of point the finger at the religious experience at all, or was it just the insular nature of the community that they would?
I think it was both. Yeah, I definitely had to work through aspects of both of those things. And to be honest, for the religious community I grew up in, there was no separation between those two things, right? It was insular. It was insular because of the religious commitments of the people in the community, and because of the religious commitments in the community, it was insular, right? So it kind of went both ways. So one of the central tenets was just like this idea of separation from the world, right? So the idea being that, look, we need to be separated both in our appearance and our behavior, and literally separate, like by having our own schools and things like that, right? It was only when I became a little bit older and I encountered people who'd grown up, in like the Orthodox tradition or things like that, Orthodox Judaism, things like that, that I realized, oh, there are other communities that are just as restrictive and in some ways just as insular as the one I grew up in different but related ways, that I started to realize that I wasn't alone, right? And even with this kind of experience. But yeah, it was definitely some of both of those things for sure, both the insularity and the religious stuff.
Yeah, and I think you rightly have pointed out that this is maybe another level of
Mm-hmm.
a bubble, right? So not just the typical evangelical experience of being within the Christian bubble, but also, like you say, physically the community is separate.
Mm-hmm.
Physically, you have these, different appearance, different changes, and I think that's a good comparison to the Orthodox Jewish tradition as well, where very, very, very separate, and that's going to have an effect on a kid, and obviously come out as you grow up and recognize the impact that's had on your life.
Right. Yeah. And maybe another point of reference for people who might not be familiar with this kind of tradition would be the Amish, right? I think most people are familiar with the Amish communities. So I mentioned that just because, the community I grew up in wasn't as restrictive or as insular as most Amish communities, but it was several degrees, removed from that in some sense. So people had cars and things like that, but the traditional dress, the abstaining from things like, watching TV or things like that. Right. And I was growing up kind of in the late 90s, early 2000s. So there's no internet, right? Or it was very limited. It's not like it is now where, like just having access to the internet would sort of allow you a portal to the world, in a lot of ways. So not having a TV meant just sort of being cut off from popular culture almost wholesale, right?
Okay, so therapy sounds like that really helped. I want to hear the story going from agnostic to you call yourself an atheist now. So what was that transition like for you?
Yeah. Interesting thing is that took place over quite a number of years. And it happened in stages. And this is one of the things that really impressed itself upon me, just like hearing other people's stories on this podcast or other podcasts, how common that is. But I did go through a brief period where I was probably about 25 or 26 when I tried to find a way to come back to certain aspects of Christianity. I was kind of seeking in a way for something to replace the religious belief that I'd had. I think I still felt guilty about it. I still missed certain aspects of it. For a while, I was reading a lot about Buddhist traditions. I even went to a Zendo a couple of times, like a Zen Buddhist meeting. And it just didn't click for me. It didn't work. Those traditions seem to have the same issues as the tradition I grew up in, just in different ways. I started reading some of the Christian mystics. So that was one way I tried to kind of like find a way back into Christianity. I thought, well, okay, maybe I can reject all these aspects of, the more structured belief system, but maybe I can find some kind of very personal way of connecting with some idea of the divine, And so I tried reading a couple of the Christian mystics, and I just found it, to be honest, kind of repulsive. I remember at the time just being totally turned off by a lot of the self-effacing language that really bothered me. This idea of like, oh, I'm so terrible, I'm so horrible, I'm like this depraved, like sinful, being, and only God can kind of pull me out of that. I found that just a huge turnoff in these mystics that I was sort of reading. So I think that was when I was like, okay, I don't think that there's any way I can kind of pull anything out of this. It's just too far removed from things I believe. At the time, I also remember that I started listening to a series of lectures by Dale Martin, who is in the religious studies department, or at least used to be in the religious studies department at Yale University. There were this open Yale courses online. And I started listening to a series of his lectures on the history of the New Testament. And it was the first time that I'd ever really considered the historicity of the Bible as a document, and just realizing the ways in which it was constructed. I just realized, oh yeah, of course, this is totally constructed by human beings. Like, I probably believed that before in some vague sense, but hadn't really kind of worked through it in any systematic way. And once I started listening to those lectures, I was like, okay, yeah, at this point, that's completely out the window for me in terms of like being able to like affirm any of these beliefs as being, from God or something like that. Right. So that was a major influence on me at the time. And at this point, I'm around 24, 25 years old. I'm going to therapy. I returned to college. I'm studying philosophy now. I'd started out doing an English degree and then kind of switched over to philosophy. So I'm learning how to think systematically and critically about all kinds of things.
I want to touch back on the historicity issue. Within the Mennonite tradition, was the Bible focused on, important? Was there a sense of authority, inerrancy, those kinds of things within that tradition?
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Okay.
Yeah. So the Bible is seen to be the divinely inspired, inerrant word of God.
Okay.
The group I grew up in was pretty rigid about only using particular translations. So they pretty much just used the King James Version. That was the version that they felt was most, I guess, authoritative or adhered most closely to their own beliefs. I know one thing that a lot of people were pretty concerned about, and this was like another major tenet, was in the King James Version, the wording suggests something like, women should wear a covering over their hair.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a major belief that was part of that tradition at the time, that I grew up with. And so, like, for example, that kind of belief, they felt like the King James version of the Bible most clearly articulated. And in more modern translations, there's more ambiguity around what that meant and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think you've expressed something that I felt as well, where you just kind of make the assumption, like you've been taught, this is authoritative, it's trustworthy, what it has to say, you can rely on. And then when you actually go to investigate yourself, you find that it's basically a house of cards, right? It's and for people who have grown up in a tradition that especially have the doctrine of inerrancy, that can just be devastating. That's the beginning of the end for most people.
Yeah. And I had some sense, I think, even before, like I was saying, before I kind of started investigating in a more systematic way, that there were aspects of the Bible that weren't, that were more literary or seemed to come together in ways that were influenced by people. But I hadn't really thought about how far down that went, I guess. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So investigating that a little bit more, just out of interest's sake, really helped me get a sense of why the Bible no longer worked for me, and all these other aspects of Christianity, why they weren't something that was going to work for me. I think at that point I would have, I started out kind of being an agnostic with, who was sort of undecided. I mean, I guess the term agnostic can mean a lot of things, right? Does it mean
Sure.
that you reject certainty in God, but that you still believe? Or does it mean that you reject certainty in the existence of God, but that you don't believe, that kind of thing. So I think I started out as an agnostic who felt like a lot of doubts there that I couldn't kind of resolve. And because of that, I couldn't affirm a belief in God. But then I kind of moved along the spectrum of agnosticism. And then for a while, I was sort of probably would have said, well, I have some theistic inclinations or something like that. Like I still think maybe there's, maybe there's some kind of like divine author of the universe, but it's totally just has nothing to do with Christianity or something like that. Right. So there was a period of time where I would have probably said something like that, like almost like a deistic kind of thing, like God created the world and just kind of lets things work like clockwork. But eventually I reached a point where I felt more comfortable with the idea of atheism. And I can't point to a specific moment for that. But I think like some of these points along the way are clearly pushing me in that direction. Yeah.
And what we say all the time here is, it's not one thing, it's 1,000 things, right? It's,
right.
You discover about yourself, I no longer believe. And then you can, in hindsight, look at some of the things that pushed you that direction. But yeah, it's not something that necessarily happens all at once.
For sure. And I think a big part of it too was getting over the guilt that I felt. And it's complicated, right? I mean, some of the guilt was associated with just me not being able to be a Christian anymore, but some of it was also went further back. I have 4 siblings. So 3 of us are not members of the church. 2 are. So there's a lot of pressure on me. I was the youngest of 5 kids. 2 of my older brothers had kind of already left the church. So there's a lot of pressure on me to join the church, to be part of it, because I was the youngest of 5. I was almost like a kind of tiebreaker, I think, in a way, it's sort of like, well, if he's part of the church, then at least most of our kids are in the church, right? That kind of thing.
Successful parenting. Yeah.
Successful parenting. Yeah. So there's a lot of pressure there. And I think that just knowing on some level that I was probably a disappointment in a lot of ways to my parents because of that. I probably felt a lot of guilt about that, I think. And my relationship with my parents wasn't very good for a lot of those years. It's much better now. I'm a little bit older.
Okay.
I'm in my 30s. But, I think probably for me and for them, just kind of coming to terms and being able to accept each other for who they are, right, was a big part of that journey and that process as well.
I want to talk a little bit about now. It sounds like education, therapy, travel, reading, all of those things were really positive impacts on your life. What is fulfilling to you now? What are the things that you look to for some of that existential need that we all humans have?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, I did end up becoming an academic. So I'm a PhD student now. After I finished my bachelor's degree in philosophy, I sort of worked in restaurants for a while and kind of bounced around between doing different things. But eventually I went on to graduate school, enrolled in a master's program in philosophy, did that, and then went on to go into a PhD program. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm currently working on my dissertation. So there's always been, I think for me, like a real sense of fulfillment in learning. And I think even just going back to like, when I was a kid, like I can remember sitting in church service, in like the sweltering, like Pennsylvania summer, humidity in a button up shirt, just sweating and listening to the sermon and just kind of questioning some of those things like, wait, this doesn't sound right. This doesn't fit together. Right. So I think that kind of philosophical kind of attitude that I had even from the time I was probably 10, 12, 13, 14 years old just kind of carried through for me. And that's still a big part of who I am, and how I live my life now. So that's something that I find fulfilling. I still find, a sense of community. I think friendships are extremely important. And maybe that sounds sort of obvious in some sense, but I think it's an easy thing to overlook. Especially if you're in academia, sometimes you can get sort of caught up in the individual pursuit of learning or things like that. But yeah, friendship, connection with other people, community, even through music, again, things like that. I think those things are still important to me. Yeah.
And I think friendship is one of those things that as you become an adult, you have to be more and more intentional about.
Yes.
Actually giving time to your friendships that is not as easy when you've got lots of other obligations.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. And it is the case that if you don't have kind of like a prefabricated community for you, right, you have to kind of go out there and create it for yourself. And part of that's finding the kinds of friendships that you do kind of connect with and things like that. So for me, that was a thing I had to learn early on as well, because I was like, well, I don't feel super comfortable or like finding like a place for myself in these like church communities I'm kind of bouncing around between. So I'm going to have to find, a sense of community somewhere else or friendships outside of that, and I think that's a big part of what allowed me to leave. Right. Something else to mention too, is that these communities do retain most of the people that, grow up in them. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my family is pretty unusual in the sense that the majority of my siblings are not part of the church, but that's very unusual. Most families retain all their kids in the faith. Yeah.
Jordon, as we wrap up, the main question that pops up for me is you kind of buried the lead. That you're a PhD candidate in philosophy. Sounds like that's been a major part of your academic career.
Yeah.
A lot of philosophy is literally about the question of the existence of God.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you'd maybe trace your experience of that when you first began your bachelor's to where you are now, and how you feel about those philosophical arguments.
Yeah. So my particular area of expertise, the thing I work on, is not necessarily directly related to that. So I work on questions. I work on French and German philosophy. I work on questions concerned with self-awareness, self-knowledge, self-consciousness, and how that relates to human rationality. In a broad sense, that's what I work on. Now, those questions aren't totally removed from questions about the existence of God, because those are questions about knowledge, about epistemology, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that sense, there are connections. But I've always been interested in some of these questions that directly relate to like belief in the existence of God and so on, right? So yeah, I mean, those things, I don't spend time systematically studying them in the way that I did, but there was certainly a time, in my early 20s, especially when I was kind of like going through my bachelor's degree in particular, and kind of after that I was kind of like going through more of like the philosophy of religion stuff and thinking systematically about some of that stuff. I also teach because, part of my program is that I work as a teaching assistant for the university that I attend, and I teach introductory courses in philosophy. And so some of those introductory courses, we talk about proofs for the existence of God and things like that. So that is something where like I go through those with undergraduate students on a regular basis.
And what's that experience for you personally?
Yeah, it's really interesting for me personally because not only am I kind of working through it myself every time with the students, but it's also interesting to kind of see how students will respond to it with their own beliefs, right? So, I mean, my job as a philosopher is not to teach people what to think; it's to teach them how to think,
right?
And I want them to like systematically examine their own beliefs and think about them, critically, right? No matter what they are, and if those are religious commitments or whatever, that's fine as long as they're thinking about them critically. That's what's important to me as a teacher. But just kind of seeing how students respond to it, and I learned stuff from undergrad students, right? Like they will bring up interesting points about some of these arguments even now, right? After all my years of education, I still hear it's still interesting to me to like talk through some of these arguments and things like that now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not as though it's not as though those questions are open for me in the same way they were when I was younger. But at the same time, I have to kind of come back to the arguments with an open mind in a way. Think about what are the strengths and weaknesses of these kinds of arguments.
Well, we may need to have you come back and you can school us on the self. And that's a pretty deep topic in itself, I'm sure.
It is.
Jordon, any topic that you were hoping to get to that we haven't hit yet?
Well, one of the things I wanted to mention, just because one of the reasons I wanted to come on the program is that, I think it's important for people who might be growing up in or be part of these kinds of more restrictive groups. So Mennonites, Amish, Orthodox Jewish groups, things like that, perhaps conservative Islam, things like that are very restrictive and conservative. It can be very alienating to be in those groups and feel like you want to leave and that there's kind of no clear way out and so on. But I just want to emphasize that, one of the things I learned through my experience with therapy actually is that even people who didn't share like the kind of restrictive background that I had, that there are pieces of other people's experiences that you can find that you can kind of share, right, in common. And I think that that's a way of finding, some kind of common aspects of your experience that really helps you feel less alone if you're in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I say all the time, some of the magic about this show is the diversity of experiences, the diversity of faith traditions, the diversity of the way people have dealt with that. And, who knows who's going to react to your story, Jordon, in a way that they don't to mine or the next person's, but you learn from hearing other people's stories. And I think that's super powerful. So,
yeah.
So Jordon, thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your story with us.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Really appreciate you for having me on.
Final thoughts on the episode. Jordon's story reminds me again of how difficult it is for precocious kids growing up in a very insular environment. And Jordon's environment was even more small and limited than many of the evangelicals who are the typical listener of this podcast. No television, no public schools, and he escapes to books. I love that. I absolutely love that. And it is a testament to how education, and I mean this in the loosest sense of the term, the reading of other experiences is a way to escape the limitations of where you grew up or the bubble that you grew up in. I feel for Jordon. I could hear the guilt that he feels for being one of the 3 children who left. He wants to support his parents, but obviously he needed to move on with his own life and experience his own autonomy. As I joked with him at the end, he kind of buried the lead. He is a PhD candidate now and in some very deep, heady stuff about the self, the existence of the self. That is absolutely amazing. Would love to have Jordon back on to dig into that in further detail. But I enjoyed talking to him about how he now teaches entry-level philosophy, which, again, is often about the existence or the non-existence of God. And he has to put himself in that position of more agnostic to teach that. And I think that is wonderful and amazing. I want to thank Jordon for being on the podcast, for telling his story, for living his own life. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Jordon, for being on the show. The secular grace thought of the week is about independent thought. I think one of my character flaws is that I have to figure things out on my own. It's very difficult for me to learn from someone else. And what I'm saying here is that I'm kind of pathologically independent. My wife jokes with me. My family has joked with me over the years. I have to feel it, touch it, see it, to believe it, to know that it is true. This is a particularly bad trait within the Christian bubble because I was always asking myself questions and recognizing some questions I couldn't touch. Like if I actually found the answers to those, that I wouldn't like what I found. And so I avoided those questions. But Jordon's story reminds me that you can be within a community, and again, I think belief is very much tied to community, and the sense of not wanting to leave your community is terrifying when you realize you no longer hold the same beliefs. But be brave. Be willing to have independent thought. You don't have to take it as far as me. You can learn from others. But when you recognize that your thinking no longer fits within the insular community that you grew up in, be willing to move on, to experience the world. The world is so much bigger. There's so much more diversity and more things to experience, and you will grow as a human being as you do that. Next week, Arlene interviews Mandy. You will not want to miss that conversation. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast.